Hey guys, over the next couple days, we're going to look at monetary policy. So, yesterday, fiscal policy, that's taxing and spending to manipulate the economy. Monetary policy is different. It's more like policy for banks that ends up affecting us. So, here's what you need to know. Monetary policy is two things: controlling the money supply, which is how much like actual money is out there to get your hands on. And then credit is your ability to borrow money. So that'd be things like interest rates. Okay, so the goal of monetary policy is a little bit different. Think of fiscal policy as the big stuff, like massive tax cuts. We saw that stimulus package for the COVID-19 funding. It was like, what, $2 trillion? Massive, massive amounts. When you think of monetary policy, think of stuff that's supposed to make smaller changes, really to try to do two things. One is maybe kickstart the economy, or two, the other big one is to try to stop a slowdown. And so that's what we're seeing right now, as we're concerned about the economy possibly crashing with, massive layoffs and a lack of purchasing. The monetary policy of the government is going to be to try to slow that and keep it from happening. Um, we're going to skip over this stuff pretty quickly. The Federal Reserve is just simply the name for the central bank of the United States. There's a bunch of branches of it. There's a board, and whenever you've heard the Fed before, the Fed announces interest rate cuts, this is what you're talking about. There's a committee that basically decides the nation's monetary policy, and all they're trying to do is manipulate how much money is out there for you to get your hands on and how easy is it for you to get your hands on it. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple of different tools that the Fed uses to manage the money supply. We're going to just take one of these per day, okay, so don't get overwhelmed. I'm not going to go through all these right now. We're going to just take them easiest to most difficult. Okay, and we're going to start with the reserve requirement. The reserve requirement is the amount of money, it's a percentage of their total deposits, the amount of money that the bank has to keep in the vault overnight. Okay, that's it. The reserve requirement, how much of your total, key bank, how much of your total deposits must you keep in the vault overnight, meaning you can't lend that out to the public. Okay, that's it. That's the definition of that term. And so by changing the reserve requirement, you can alter how much money gets lent out to people to then use to buy stuff. All right, so let's say that a bank has $100,000 in deposits. The reserve requirement is 10%. Okay, so how much do they keep in the vault overnight? $10,000. How much gets lent out into the world to people as loans to go buy cars and houses and whatever? That would be 90%, the rest of it. Okay, so imagine now that the Fed changes the reserve requirement. We're going to up it from 10% to 20%. Well, would that mean that the bank has more or less money that they have to keep in the vault overnight? In this case, if the reserve requirement went from 10% to 20%, instead of keeping $10,000 in the vault, they now have to keep $20,000 in the vault. So does that mean more or less money gets lent out to the public? The result would be that less money gets lent out. Instead of 90,000 going out into the world through loans, now 80,000 is going out into the world through loans. Okay, so all they're trying to do is manipulate, can you get your hands on money? Because we know that when people have access to income, they spend it. That shifts the demand curve to the right. If it's harder for people to get their hands on money, they buy less, and that would shift the demand curve to the left. Okay, and then we're all also interested in what effect that would have on inflation. Okay, that's a lot of times what the Fed is trying to do. They're trying to control inflation. So the more spending that we have, the demand curve moves to the right, prices go up. The less spending that we have, the demand curve moves to the left, prices go down. Okay, and so that's their goal. They're either going to try to create spending, or they're going to try to stop inflation by slowing purchasing and maybe moving that demand curve back to the left a little bit. Okay, so as our example here, the Fed has announced, and this is real, they've announced that they're going to eliminate the reserve requirement in response to the economic crisis from the pandemic. They're going to eliminate the reserve requirement altogether. So what's the goal? Well, the goal is to get banks to lend out more money so that hopefully either businesses can get a hold of that money so that they can keep workers, or that people can get a hold of money easily so that they will buy more stuff. Okay, so let's try some practice scenarios here. Okay, so in this case, the Fed wants to slow inflation. So what do they have to do? They have to shift the demand curve to the left, to make prices go down. So what should they do to the money supply? Well, if we want to see less purchasing, we want to see less money going out into the world. If people can't get their hands on money, they can't spend it. So we want banks to lend out less. In order to do this, what should they do to the reserve requirement? If we want them to put less money out into the world, then they need to increase the reserve requirement. Keep more of that money in your vault, less money going out into the world. So what would the result of all that be? That would contract, that would slow the economy. The demand curve doesn't move to the right anymore. Perhaps it moves to the left to try to ease inflation. Okay, the Fed wants to make it easier to borrow money. So we want people to get their hands on cash. In order to do that, we want to put more cash into the world. So we want to increase the money supply. In order to get more money into the money supply, the Fed should decrease the reserve requirement. Less money held in the vault means more money goes out into the world for people to get their hands on and spend. The effect of that would be to expand the economy. Okay, so that's the reserve requirement. How much money does the bank have to keep in the vault overnight? And then given the goal of the Federal Reserve, that should tell you whether they're going to increase or decrease the reserve requirement. So good luck with your practice ones. If you have questions, email me.